Hello and welcome to the Washington Foreign Press Center. Today we have Interior Secretary Sally Jewell, who will deliver a conversation about wildlife trafficking in Africa. I also want to welcome the great many journalists we have from all across Africa who are joining us via telephone from our African Regional Media Hub and our embassies across Africa. Secretary Jewell is going to make brief opening remarks. We'll take a question from here in Washington, and then we'll break away to Camille at the African Regional Media Hub for the next several questions. Without further ado, here is Secretary Jewell.
Thank you very much, Andy, and thank you, Camille, and all of the reporters here in the room, as well as those that are assembled around the continent of Africa. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be with you today, and I look forward to an upcoming trip on the very challenging topic that the African continent certainly is dealing with, as well as in the U.S., as well as around the world, and that is the scourge of wildlife trafficking, which is clearly a global threat. Last summer, I had a great opportunity to travel to Vietnam and China. It's fair to say, in meeting with government officials there, that they are demand countries. They're countries, in some cases, they have supply of wildlife products, but in many cases, they have significant demand. And it was a very, very helpful trip because the United States itself is also part of the problem on wildlife trafficking, and we have to work together around the world if we're going to address this scourge. Black markets in the United States are contributing to record high demand for wildlife products. These markets here in the United States and abroad are driving many species to the brink of extinction. Much of the demand is overseas, but a lot of it comes through the United States. It involves United States citizens. There are laws broken here in the United States every single day with regard to CITES and the Lacey Act and other international laws and rules that are designed to prevent wildlife trafficking. We are part of the problem, and we want to be part of the solution. And we know the way to do that is to reach our hand across the world to work with countries, both on the demand side, as we did in Asia, but also on the source side. African countries, in many cases, are the source of a lot of these trafficked products. Elephant ivory, rhino horn, pangolin, other illegally taken wildlife is destined primarily for markets in Asia and many times coming through the United States. Criminal elements, including insurgent groups, are involved in poaching, in transporting ivory and rhino horn across Africa. And I want to just pause for a second and say that I applaud the efforts that I witnessed in Vietnam and in the conversations I had with people in China who are really now beginning in a very earnest way to raise awareness that rhino horn is no more valuable than the keratin in your fingernail. And yet its mythology is leading to the wiping out of that iconic species from Africa. And a lot of public information, particularly in Vietnam, that I witnessed when I was there. So just a few of the heartbreaking statistics that we're facing right now. Between 2011 and 2014, African elephant poaching reached the highest recorded level since records were kept beginning in 2002. In just a 3-year time span, 100,000 elephants, roughly, were killed for their ivory. That's an average of about 34,000 elephants killed each year in Africa. And the reality is, as the larger elephants with the larger tusks are killed off, now poachers are even killing babies, which means even more elephants need to be killed for the same amount of ivory. In other words, every 15 minutes, an elephant is killed for its ivory. And in the amount of time that we're going to be here together today having this conversation, 2 or 3 elephants will likely be killed. Widespread poaching also threatens extinction of critically endangered black rhinos. Their horns are hacked off, they're sold on the black market. The animals are left to die if they aren't killed outright. So we are very concerned about this in the Obama administration, very committed to addressing the issues home and working collectively with countries abroad. The President issued an executive order in 2013, which stood up a team to combat wildlife trafficking, and he asked me to co-chair that team, the President's Task Force on Wildlife Trafficking. We released a national strategy in 2014, which emphasized cross-governmental and international collaboration, which is exactly what we're doing. The Fish and Wildlife Service released an implementation plan in 2015, and we've recently created something called the U.S. Wildlife Trafficking Alliance, which brings together private sector partners, because many of the markets for these products are facilitated through private businesses, particularly online, all around the world. So we are working with those countries, or companies rather, in an alliance to address these issues. We've had a couple of opportunities to shine a spotlight on the challenge of wildlife trafficking and the impact on species. The U.S. Seized ivory from a number of different dealers. We had roughly 6 tons of it in storage in the National Wildlife Repository in Denver, Colorado. We hosted a crush of that ivory using a rock crusher. 6 tons was crushed. A lot of visibility for that, and we did a second event, which was another ton, seized largely from one particular dealer, which we did in Times Square in New York City. Tremendous amount of visibility from the local community, from the international community, and that is something that we have seen other countries do as well, which is recognizing that the only ivory that has value is the ivory that is on a live elephant, and destroying these stockpiles is one way to bring visibility to that. We recently met together with a number of different African countries. We were there at COP21 in Paris for the climate change talks, and delighted that those were successful, but it also gave us an opportunity to meet directly with senior officials from Gabon, from Kenya, and from Namibia, where we talked about methods to work together to combat wildlife trafficking and how we could work better in a collaborative way. And in those 3 examples, we already are, and that's a big part of this trip, is looking at what's working on the ground and looking at how we can do more of that. So these joint efforts with African countries and Asian countries aim to raise public awareness, to work with other governments, international governmental organizations, which have been very critical in Africa and in other countries, civil society, the private sector, and local communities, to make sure we have a maximum impact collectively on stemming illegal wildlife trade. So tomorrow I will be traveling to Gabon. It'll actually take me a couple of days, as you know. It's a long flight to get there. And I'll be continuing these important conversations, not only in Gabon, but also in Kenya and South Africa. In each of the 3 countries, I'll be having ministerial meetings with top government officials. I'll also be meeting with non-governmental organizations that are active in wildlife trafficking, and we'll be hosting roundtables with them, and they have in every single country been a very, very important partner in working with those countries and with other countries like ourselves in addressing this scourge. In Gabon, I'll be touring the Wonga-Wonga Presidential Reserve, which is home to forest elephants, gorillas. It is also a place where they are working on marine conservation as it's along the coastline, where they're doing work in turtles as well. In Kenya, in addition to the meetings with ministers and NGOs, I'll be visiting the port of Mombasa. Mombasa is one of the most critical locations where wildlife products are transited. So we'll be looking at demonstrations of anti-trafficking measures. The United States has 2 attachés from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in law enforcement. One is in Tanzania, the other is in Botswana, but they cover the landscape, and I will be there with them in addition to with local law enforcement to see what is happening around Africa on the enforcement side. And then we'll be visiting the Lewa Conservancy in Kenya to look at the efforts on the ground and look at how our cooperation between the 2 countries is working. Then in South Africa, again, in addition to the ministerial and NGO meetings, I'll be touring Kruger National Park. I guess sad commentary, we were planning to visit a wildlife crime scene, and what's unfortunate is they are confident that there will be a wildlife crime scene while I'm there, because they typically lose several rhinos each day in that country. So it will not be difficult to find a crime scene and to understand what it is they're doing with their procedures to address this scourge. We'll also be going to the Boma and Veterinary Services Center to observe animals in holding, and we'll have an overall review of rhino poaching. So that's kind of an overview of my trip. We know that if we're going to address this scourge, it has to be done on an international scale. We have to help citizens recognize that buying wildlife products is not only not cool, to kill elephants for human trinkets, to kill rhinos for products that have no value to medicine, is something that requires public education, and it requires cooperation on an international scale, and that's exactly what we're doing, so that together we can make sure that these magnificent animals, and even some animals people don't know about that are also subject to this, will be here for future generations, will drive the kind of tourism revenue that is sustainable for many of the countries in Africa, so that we won't just be looking at these animals in our picture books for our kids or on the television in recorded tape, but they will actually be there for future generations as well. So that's a quick wrap-up. I will say that I've got with me Bob Dreher, who is the Associate Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and he'll be traveling with me on this trip. I want to extend my appreciation to the State Department here and all of the embassies that are so helpful to us, as well as the countries' governments that we'll be visiting. They've all been terrific in arranging things. So with that, I'm happy to open it up to questions. And Bob will help me here on some of the technical aspects of things like the Lacey Act and the CITES, all of which are very, very important in this discussion. So with that, I think we'll start with a question from here in the room, and then we'll go to Camille to facilitate.
Start with France 24.
This is Philip Crowther with France 24. Thank you very much. You said that the United States is part of the problem, and there's a big black market where the United States is part of. Is this a case of these specific 3 African countries, and presumably others as well, wanting the United States to be held accountable for its part, or at least for the part that some black market actors play in the wildlife trafficking?
Yes, the United States is part of the problem, and admitting that and being upfront about that and identifying through our own law enforcement efforts who the perpetrators are of these crimes in the United States is going to be a very important part of solving this puzzle that we have. Many of the products transit different ports around the world, and many of them come through the United States. There are dealers in wildlife products in the United States. The crush that we did in Times Square, a ton of ivory, was largely due to the seizure from one particular dealer in Philadelphia. This happens around the country here in the United States. It happens elsewhere in the world as well. But we know that we must step forward and address the issues on our own shores, as well as working collaboratively with the demand countries, and this is a demand country as well, but for transshipment, for enforcing of the laws that are out there so that we can bring these people to justice.
So can I imagine literally calls coming in from the governments of Gabon, for example, saying, we're seeing that there is too much traffic through the United States, come on over and do something about it?
I would say no, it's more through our own law enforcement efforts and the forensics that we are able to do through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We can determine the source of the ivory that we're getting. We will know from the forensic analysis whether it is in fact legal ivory like antiques or whether it has been illegally obtained. And in many cases we're working with the source countries on forensics so that we can jointly identify the transit of these products and address it where it's the biggest challenge. So it's a collaborative effort. I think more than the African countries calling us saying you have a problem, we're saying we have a problem, we want to work with you. We are seeing where this material is coming from, and we want to work with you to stop it at its source as well as stop the demand. Do you want to add anything?
I would just add that we have strong programs in all 3 of these countries supporting their efforts to combat wildlife trafficking. Training programs, we have wildlife conservation funding for the species involved. So some of this is just following up on our close partnership with these countries in trying to tackle this problem.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Camille, do you have a caller?
Yes, and thank you, Secretary Jewell, for speaking with us today. And as you know, there are a number of journalists around Africa who have dialed into the call. For the journalists on the line, just a reminder to please press *1 on your phone if you would like to join the question queue. We have received a number of questions by email in advance. I'm going to start with one of those questions. If anyone would like to submit additional questions by email, you may send those to afmediahub@state.gov. The first question comes from a journalist in Madagascar, Mr. Matthew Ramasirasolo from Charatra newspaper. Have the major countries reached a deal against the import of endangered fauna and flora from Africa? If yes, why aren't they efficient? And what measures would the U.S. be able to implement or suggest? Next part of the question is specific to Madagascar, but you could broaden your response to include Africa in general. According to international organizations, the second destination country for rosewood from Madagascar after China is the U.S. Does it mean you cannot control the import of non-raw precious wood logs? Are there any measures to block this illegal trade?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. There are two key laws in the United States that we use to enforce wildlife trafficking and the trafficking in illegal logs like rosewood, for example. One is CITES. So CITES is the
Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species,
right.
So it's an international convention.
Yes, so there will be a CITES meeting coming up in South Africa later on this year. That will be the Council of Parties 17, I think, in the case of CITES. It is an international law that the United States has signed up to enforce on its own shores, and it is the key legislation or key tool that we use to prosecute wildlife trafficking here. So there is no question that we have laws in place. The challenge for us and for other countries is in enforcement. We're getting better at it. There's no question about it. We are working with ports around the world as well as our own ports to identify the illegal smuggling of these products. We're using additional tools to be able to identify what is in shipments, and we are active in prosecuting. The Lacey Act would be the statute that we would use for something like the illegal importation of rosewood. That is happening in manufacturing of guitars and so on. We did a major bust of a company in the United States that was using illegal rosewood. Just as recently, we did a very visible case on lumber liquidators and a very significant fine that was for wood being used mostly in building products. Those kinds of visible enforcement actions raise awareness that this is not okay. Raise awareness among the users of these products so that they are not looking for guitars, for example, or other products made from illegally obtained wood. So the Lacey Act and CITES are the two key tools. Enforcement is a challenge for us, just as it is for people around the world. We don't have as many resources as we would like, but we have increased those resources and put attachés around the world so that we can help address it in the source country, including, as I mentioned, 2 attachés in Africa. Do you want to mention anything else?
I would just mention that the concept of the Lacey Act, which is an American statute, is that we have the authority to assist other countries to enforce their own laws. If timber is taken illegally in a source country, it makes it illegal to import it into the United States because it violates the host country's laws. The same concept is embodied in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement. All of the countries that are signing up to that trade agreement are committing to actually enforce against violations of other countries' laws in the taking of this kind of material. So it's a reciprocal assistance concept, and it's very important.
Next question.
Okay, the next question is going to go to a journalist at the listening party at the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi, Kenya. Operator, please open the line for Nairobi.
All right. My name is Alphonse Shiundu, and my question to the Secretary is, she spoke about the link between insurgent groups and wildlife crime. So I just want to get a sense of what her visit aims to achieve in Kenya more so because of the link between the poaching and the terror group Al-Shabaab. So if she's going to address that, I would appreciate. And then I would need a bit of insight on how potent she thinks this threat, this nexus between wildlife trafficking and terrorism is. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that question, and I very much look forward to visiting your country. I will say this, that my area of expertise is around wildlife trafficking and wildlife. It is not in international terrorism. But I do understand from speaking with my colleagues in the State Department and elsewhere that we are now dealing with organized crime syndicates. We are dealing with insurgent groups. I don't have them by name, but certainly the implication are those that are active in Africa. Just as we see in human trafficking, in drug trafficking, the trafficking of illegal products and the profit margins associated with that become a mechanism for funding some of these insurgent activities around the world. So we do know from our law enforcement efforts that organized crime is involved, that insurgent groups are involved, but to deal with that specifically is something that we leave up to the international law enforcement as well as our colleagues in the Department of State and other law enforcement bodies. Anything you want to add to that, Bob?
I think that's right.
Okay.
Okay, the next question was submitted by email from Columbus Mafunga, VOA correspondent in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe government officials and tourism operators have complained about the recent ban on the import of lion and elephant trophies by the United States Wildlife and Fisheries Service. What has been the rationale for this decision, and is there any dialogue between the U.S. and African officials to ensure continued sustainable trophy hunting that will sustain African economies?
Well, thank you for the question. I'll take a crack at it at a high level, and then I'll turn it to Bob for a bit more detail. Let me say this, that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does govern the importation of hunting trophies, and it is very careful to ensure that when it allows the importation of trophies, that it does so with countries that are in fact putting the money from the from basically the sale of that opportunity to hunt for that trophy directly into communities to enable those communities to support conservation measures for the species. We do not allow the importation of trophies right now from Zimbabwe because the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does not believe that sufficient measures are being put in place in that country to support the conservation efforts in local communities. And that is something that is, trophy hunting is difficult to explain, but in countries where it works well, the occasional hunt, and it's highly limited, is typically of animals that are beyond reproductive age, that are in some cases more problematic to the future of that species than if they were culled. And they do it in a way where the revenue from that hunt, which is in some cases hundreds of thousands of dollars, goes back into that local community, because we know that for local communities it's not easy to live with some of these species. And facilitating that through economic development and revenue to them is very, very important. So that is the position that we've taken. Zimbabwe has not got a program that, to our satisfaction, addresses those issues. where a country like Namibia does. So it's, I think, very important that countries work with us and work with local communities to make sure that the resources get to the people where they are intended. Bob, do you want to add anything to that?
I would just clarify that the policy that we have on trophy imports applies to endangered species that are listed under our Endangered Species Act, and we have, of course, a responsibility to ensure the preservation and the sustainable conservation of endangered species. So when American hunters participate in trophy hunting overseas, they're subject to the Endangered Species Act, and they need a permit from the Fish and Wildlife Service to import a trophy. It doesn't apply to all trophy hunting, but where there's endangered species involved, it's very important for us to ensure that trophy hunting is contributing directly to the conservation of that species in the wild. Now, the question was asked about what our engagement has been with the government of Zimbabwe. We've worked very closely with the government of Zimbabwe for almost 2 years now to clarify their management structure, to assist them in developing conservation plans for elephant. Elephant is currently the species that we are not permitting import of trophies from Zimbabwe. And we have hope that we can work with the government of Zimbabwe to the point where they have a very demonstrable conservation program in place that would permit us to allow imports. The lion has just been listed, and the issue of showing that there is a conservation benefit for lions in the wild would apply to any country from which American hunters try to import trophy lions. So we'll be looking to work with all of the range countries in Africa where there is hunting of lions to help make that conservation program real.
I will just add that one of the conversations that I had in both Vietnam and China was a concern about trophy hunting and the aspirations of other countries around the world to do the same. And I think that it's very important that we work together with a common understanding of trophy hunting and the benefits it can bring to a species, but also the risks if it is done in a way that doesn't assure conservation.
One more.
Okay, we had another question submitted by email. This is from Emmanuel Egunza of BBC Africa in Nairobi. You talk about the U.S. working with African countries to stop illegal wildlife trade in the American black market. But countries like Kenya are facing devastating levels of poaching and trafficking, with the key market being China and Asia. Have you engaged the governments in dealing with trafficking through these routes, which are a bigger problem?
Yes, thank you. I probably answered some of that in my opening comments. There's no question that illegal wildlife trafficking is very much on the radar of both Vietnam and China. Both are high-demand countries, but also in some cases source countries as well. In my high-level meetings, which went up to the Prime Minister of Vietnam and to the Vice Premier of China, there was a universal willingness and desire to work with the United States and other countries to address this issue. China, in President Xi's visit to the United States recently, announced a near total ban on ivory. And that is something that they're working through the process of implementing. We have done the same in the United States through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. These are very, very important steps. In China, you've got an effort going on by public figures like Yao Ming, the famous basketball star, who are doing public service announcements around how wildlife trafficking is wrong and its impact on elephant and rhino species, among others, around Africa in particular. So I would say that the meetings were very successful. We have continued to move forward with them on enforcement actions. We have attachés, as I mentioned, in Africa, but we also have them in Asia and in South America, working closely with the governments there on addressing the issues, sharing technical assistance, and putting in place the kind of tracking mechanisms to bring these people around the world to justice. So I would say very much that The demand countries are working hard to be part of the solution, just as the source countries are as well. And we respect very much the impact on the countries in Africa that are feeling the brunt of this, and we want to be helpful. Anything you want to add, Bob?
Great.
Okay.
Okay, we'll take one question here in Washington from Voice of America.
I'm Carolyn Turner from Voice of America TV. I've been doing a lot of stories on wildlife trafficking, and one of the questions our viewers would want to understand is, what authority does the United States have to tell a sovereign nation to dictate to them what they can do with their animals, number one, and then if they had of their own volition chosen to protect these animals, what kind of help, what kind of aid, what kind of resources would be available from the United States, and what would be their path to obtain it?
Great. Well, so a couple of answers there. CITES is an international agreement that countries sign up for, and the United States is one, and the countries in Africa that we referenced are also a party to CITES, where we agree to jointly address the challenge of threatened and endangered flora and fauna around the world. So that is basically, I don't know if you'd call it a treaty or an agreement.
It's a treaty.
It's a treaty. And we can jointly enforce that through our work and through their work. The Lacey Act that Bob mentioned earlier is a U.S. law that enables us to prosecute American companies who are involved in the importation of illegal products. So we have used the Lacey Act recently, as I mentioned, in the lumber liquidators suit and in one against a guitar manufacturer as well. So it's a combination of U.S. laws as well as international treaties. Bob mentioned the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is TPP. It is working its way through the process. Agreement has been reached, I think 14 countries in total. And as Bob mentioned earlier, that will give us the ability to help enforce local laws that are designed to protect species, flora, and fauna in other countries. So, for example, if there was an illegal shipment of logs or a shipment of wildlife products coming into the United States that violated the law of that country that was shipping them, we could seize that product and work with law enforcement in that local country to bring those people to justice in that local country. So it's through international cooperation and treaties. It is through our own laws that we can help enforce. On the assistance side, I think we did about $18 million in Africa alone last year in the form of grants and assistance to African countries. It's everything from night vision goggles, which help local law enforcement there see what's going on with poachers and address it. It is other forms of equipment. It's forensic laboratories so that they can do the analysis needed to bring people to justice. It is working on the ground with the agencies, for example, in Gabon, where I'll be visiting. We've provided technical assistance that's helped move their equivalent of our National Park Service from really more of a interpretive and wildlife management agency into now also a law enforcement agency, because they are seeing encroachment across their borders to the north and to the east into their forests, and which is beginning to impact their forest elephants as well as their timber. So we're helping them set up law enforcement. We're providing that technical assistance. We're doing exchanges. Likewise, in other countries, we have, in some cases, sister park agreements, sister wildlife refuge agreements, where people from that foreign park, I signed one when I was in China, the Baihuashan agreement between Shenandoah National Park outside of Washington, D.C., and Baihuashan Nature Preserve, which is just outside of Beijing, are working cooperatively on management. So, those are a handful of ways that we're working across governments to share best practices and expertise, but also to share equipment and knowledge and training so that we can collectively learn from each other.
I think as Secretary Jewell's response makes clear, we don't dictate to other countries what they must do. We work cooperatively with other countries. Now, the the world can join together under CITES and adopt resolutions that can have binding effect on countries, range countries, as well as destination countries and demand countries. And it has done so with very strong resolutions, international resolutions that have binding effect on all the parties with respect to elephant ivory and rhino horn. But those are international agreements and international enforcement actions. The place where we have authority is over the conduct of our own citizens. So if we have an issue involving the import of trophies, for example, of endangered species from any foreign country, and it's not just Africa, of course, it's other places around the world, we can require conduct by our citizens that will help ensure the preservation of an endangered species. So again, we're not dictating to other countries, and we're providing assistance and funding and working very, very cooperatively. I think you will see that the countries we're going to are going to be engaged with us in a really deep and far-ranging conversation about how we can work better together, because this is a problem we all share.
Okay.
Camille, do you want to ask?
I think we have.
Go ahead, sorry.
Do we have time for another call? Another question from the line?
We do.
Yeah. Yes.
Great. Okay, let's please take a question from Ekele Peter Agbo of the Leadership newspaper in Nigeria. Operator, please open the line. The line is open.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear
Go
you.
ahead, please.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Ekele Peter Agbo, Leadership newspapers, Abuja, Nigeria. My question is to the Interior Secretary, Stanley Joel. Why did you choose only these three countries, Gabon, Kenya, and South Africa? Are they the only African countries where you have illegal wildlife activities?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. Certainly, they are not the only African countries that have an issue. There are many African countries that are dealing with this issue, and it really became a function of my availability and the amount of time I could devote to this, and getting different examples from different parts of Africa that help illustrate the challenges that we face. I will also say that these are countries where we do have active efforts, and there are other African countries as well, where we could see on the ground what's working, will help me make the case to support these efforts around all of Africa. So Gabon is a country with very ambitious initiatives, Gabon Bleu, Gabon Vert, which are looking at the preservation of species both on land and in the sea. They've done some very innovative things, and I've met several times with officials, including the president of Gabon here in the United States, to talk about their efforts. So in part it is to appreciate those efforts, to learn from them, and to share them with others that I meet with. South Africa, very large country, obviously, as is Nigeria. Nigeria is bigger. Very active with us in wildlife trade and enduring a very, very significant challenge with regard to rhinos. Kenya, also a country we've worked closely with. Both Kenya and Gabon were countries that I was able to meet with while I was at the COP21 in Paris. And so I have an established relationship with ministers from those two countries. We added South Africa because of the significant challenges that it has right now with regard to rhinos. But it's by no means in any way an indication that other countries aren't in serious trouble with this, and we will continue to work with our people on the ground and in the embassies with any African countries that would like to work with us to address this issue, and we're open to suggestions from other countries on what we can do to improve our own efforts, both in the United States as well as abroad. Do you want to mention anything else?
Nope, I think that's exactly
Okay.
right.
Great. Thank you for the question.
Okay. Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, I am Fanny André from AFP, and I would like to know how extraordinary it's for a secretary like you to do this trip really focused on wildlife trafficking. and if there was a key moment with your team that made you decide to do this trip, and if maybe that key moment was over the summer when the trophy hunting story happened with this lion, Cecil the lion. Did it influence your decision to do this? And lastly, if why would you feel people are ready to change their mind now? Because you say you want to change people's mind about trafficking.
Well, I will say that from the day I took this job, which was in the spring of 2013, wildlife trafficking was already very much on the president's mind. He issued his executive order with regard to wildlife trafficking shortly after I took this job. So it has been on the minds of the Obama administration as a deep concern. I have been happy to pick up the mantle as part of the portfolio of what we do in the Department of the Interior. In my first weeks on the job, I met with the law enforcement lead for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who helped educate me on the challenges that we have in this country with wildlife trafficking. Probably one of the most meaningful visits I did was to the Wildlife Repository just outside of Denver, Colorado, which I would invite all of you to go and visit. It is where we store all of the illegally confiscated items. There are many designer brands there, things like tortoiseshell sunglasses, cowboy boots made of endangered species, ladies' handbags, belts, all manner of items that turn your stomach. There are many, many tigers staring out from the walls as they've been turned into carpets. There are, elephant foot tables, and there are whole rhino heads. There are packets and packets of medicines from illegal wildlife products that have no value, but have wiped out species. So I would say that was a very powerful experience for me. But this is really a continuation of very important work that's been going on for years by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I think what is bringing it to a head for President Obama and for me and for others is just how dramatic the increase has been in the slaughter of elephants and the slaughter of rhinos. And potentially because of the increase in insurgent activities and the view from organized criminals that this is another source of revenue for their nefarious activities, has made it much more of a significant issue than I think it was just 5 years ago. So the State Department has been an important partner in this effort around the world, and having an opportunity to visit and to bring visibility to this, I think is important not only for me and the people that work with me that are concerned about this around the world, but also to the President of the United States who started this effort with his executive order, and frankly to the many people that are working collaboratively with me, the business side, volunteer side in the Wildlife Trafficking Task Force that are putting real muscle behind these efforts.
Is this repository open to the public?
They do tours for the public, and particularly for youth groups and children to raise awareness, but we can certainly organize that for you. It is part of the complex. It's the Rocky Mountain Arsenal National Wildlife Refuge just north of Denver, pretty convenient to the Denver airport. I did say when I went through the facility, anything that has a designer brand, put on a table up front so that people know that these brands that they may be buying and may be associated with are also associated with wiping out wildlife species and not paying attention to laws in local countries as well as our own laws in the United States. So we would certainly welcome a visit. I don't know if it's open on a regular schedule, Bob, or if it's just tours, but
certainly we can facilitate a visit.
yeah, for anybody that wants to see it.
Okay, well, that will have to be our last question. I want to thank our callers from across Africa and our participants in the room, and I want to thank Secretary Jewell for her remarks.
Thank you. I look forward to visiting the continent, and if I'm not catching your country this time, I look forward to a future visit. Thank you very much.